Alrighty, so Learn Together Week 12. I'm actually recording this the Thursday before this is due, and I'm going to go over this work in a minute, but basically this is a summary of what we covered in the code up for this first part of section 8. But what I want to say is just a few words, and I'll start with part 2. So for part 1, and I'll add this because I know that was confusing last time, is I want a print screen of your final, what your site looked like once you added all this functionality, and then a link to your code. And on this part, I want you to write something, and I'm going to add really something here about what I want. So, and I'll tell you as we go through. Okay, so for the part 2, I had intended to do a second video, but time didn't allow it. So I want to show you what I ended up with close to a finished product for mine. And this is one of the things, and I had started to mention it in the first video, but I definitely want to say in the next one, anytime we do inputs, the one thing, and Andrew doesn't really cover this, but I think he talks about validation later. There's something really simple you can do by just putting the required attribute on an input field, is so that when you do that, you prevent the user from submitting without any data. Now there's ways in your code you could do that, right? But this is like the minimum you would want to do anytime you ask for user input. And the other thing I did is I did media queries using Flexbox. Now if you don't know what that is, at minimum, I would hope that students coming in have some HTML and CSS, which includes understanding how to do responsive design. So I'm actually going to require this on the next one, and I didn't on this one. I did talk to, you'll hear me talk about this to students who come in. But basically what this means is that as we move to looking at things on a mobile device, and we really talk about development being mobile first, and desktop second, and other ways of thinking about this. But in here, if I move to a mobile device, right, so I can choose, right, so if I Pixel XL, right, so this is the idea that I would then create media queries that at a certain what we call breakpoint, then these become stacked on each other, right? So this is something I want to see you at least be able to do, and I'll show the code. It's pretty simple to do. You just tell a media query, then at that breakpoint how you want your style, your layout style to. And in my case, I use Flex. There's grid, CSS grid and other things you can do that. But at minimum, I would want to have some design here, which I have, and then at least a media query. Okay, so again, as I'm starting to think about Develop It 3, I think we're going to continue this idea from here out, where on the two programs that you chose, we'll continue working on the one you chose. The one you didn't choose, we're going to do for Develop It 1, or for the Learn Togethers. Okay, so we end up doing 2 rounds of code after what you've done doing the code in there, which hopefully in my estimate should really help you retain this information. So for this particular, okay, so in here, right, so what I want you to talk about is anything that I've talked about, like as we move forward, how much do you know about media queries? I will put in a couple links here showing how to learn about media queries and Flexbox, right? So, and maybe just talk about how much HTML and CSS experience you have here would be good, and any other feedback about doing your Develop It 3. Okay, but here, so now moving to here. So as I mentioned before, I want you to choose the thing you didn't implement for Develop It 3. And some of you may have been doing this already in the Learn Togethers, but now I actually want to formalize the process. And so here are the general steps, again, just taking what we've learned, right, is if you don't already have it, you get user input. Because when I looked at where I had left off, because my first one was my energy tracking program. So first, if you don't already have it, you have to implement user input, store the input data in local storage, add a checkbox or a button or some other input types that relate to your data, set up UUID, target the UUID to complete the functionality in whatever you added here, right? And this is one of those things, right? So obviously I can't gauge this. I'm just asking you to reflect upon, in this case, how well were you able to code this up without referring, or how much did you have to refer? I noticed in mine, because after I wrote this, I was like challenging myself to see how much. And I would say I had to actually look back of the 100% of the time it took me to complete this. About 70% I was able to do on my own. 30% I had to remember one or two things. So, you gauge it, and this really is a gauge for yourself, right? So let me just show you what my energy tracker, and this is similar to what I want for, and I'm actually going to go ahead right now and enter some data, right? So what I did is I used that nice input, so I can choose a date, and this is my energy tracker. I'm going to say 20. I hit submit, so it refreshes the screen. But again, what I want to make sure here is that if I refresh, I still get the data. And then what I should be getting on my local storage here is I should be getting that unique ID for that item, right? The date and then the kilowatt. So the other thing I've done here is I've actually also sorted the data. So if I do something like third, right? So if I do something like 80, good. So in that case, right? So actually, let me do it again. So I'm going to put, it's a little hard to see because let me actually do a forward date. And by the way, I didn't restrict it to do forward dates ahead, right? So we can see here that when you enter different dates, what it's doing in my case, I think it is, let me make sure here. Yeah, it's sorting the data, right? So let me come over here and see if I can increase, no. So, but more than anything, when you do your print screen, right, I want you to show me that you're using here and then using seeing if there's any issues on the console. So just a brief look at the code here. I did end up, I'm going to zoom this out a little bit. I did end up, in my case, splitting it in, because I really think that idea of what he showed with taking and putting in, right, your energy, well, for me, the apps versus the functions, I think is a really great idea. And I got most of it here, right? So here's why I'm entering my data. I'm going and generating that UUID, again, the idea of the third party, grabbing those two values, and after that, setting them as blank, saving the data, and then and actually what I should do here, and maybe is actually sort my data. Maybe that's the piece right here I was not seeing clearly. So then in my functions, right, so I have my get save data, and this is where we're storing it in local memory. And then if it's not null, right, we parse that data, and if it's not there, if there's nothing, so then we just create that empty array. And then here's where we're just saving the data. Right, so in this section we learn parse and stringify in order to write things into local storage, because it's going to write it as a JSON, so we have to actually move it between, because JavaScript, even though it's a JavaScript object notation, needs it in its preferred style. And this is not unique to JavaScript. This is for anything that you use when you're processing JSON data. So you're going to see this a lot in your time here. And again, it happened up here where we get the data out, right, and it's in JSON format, and then we parse it so that we have it in regular object format. And again, and if you look at it in the local data, you can see that this is actually in that format. So rendering the data, I ended up not doing some of the, and I didn't require this. I did do a sort, right? So matter of fact, I think I'll just go ahead now that I've mentioned this, because I think I need to here is do that sort right there. So I did do a sort. I did clear the fields whenever I re-render the data. I did separate this out into a generate DOM for each one. There's my sort feature, and then I ended up writing functions or functions called by other functions in order to do the remove day. Oh yeah, and so that's the other thing I did. So you need to implement something. I'll move. This is what the print screen would look like, but I did end up doing a delete, right? And I at least want one, whether it's complete or incomplete, something when you're listing that data that you actually take action on. And so that's where we learned how to, in the render function, right? Oh, back here. So when we're rendering the DOM, generating the DOM, right here. So that's where, when we're rendering that, you go through and you add some kind of add event listener for each one of them. And then in there I removed it, right? So it was a great review. I really think this was a wonderful review for me. And I think it will be for you, because these are really, there's a lot of meat, and when I say that, is a lot of content in these sections that we just went over. Okay, and one thing, and I'm curious about this, so you can write about this on your reply, is, do you do all of these in one setting? And my feedback to you is, I think if you're doing that, if you're able to walk away really understanding, then great, good for you. I find for me, I can do about 3 or 4 of these, and then I actually need to kind of sit with it a little bit, think about it, reflect on it, come back and review the code to make sure I understand it. So I think taking this in more sizable little chunks is a better way to do this. But again, I can't dictate to you, nor should I. I'm just giving you suggestions on how to really get the most out of this, right? So, I'm curious, and again, on your reply here, right? So anything, and I'll put some of these other topics I've talked about. I'd like you to talk about, the HTML, CSS, how much of that experience, do you know what media queries are? And then also anything that came out of 3. And then again, this idea of how much time are you giving yourself? Because I notice many people not many, half of you are submitting it the night it's due, but some of you are submitting it ahead of time. So I'm curious. So the next set, we'll talk about this later. We'll continue, and this is great. We're going to talk about another third-party library called Moment, which is awesome. But I want to give you the heads up. We end up doing, for this round, we'll do 3 weeks, and then we'll do the develop it. We'll do all of section 9, which is really just learning some new things, not really adding too much functionality, learning about catch and throw, such an important thing, handling form application errors. This is something I just briefly mentioned. And then 10. So 10 is actually where we end. We don't end up, right? We don't 11, 12, and 13, but I definitely recommend, if your time allows, you do at least 11. And I'd be willing to talk about, if on your own before the end of the semester, if you do 11, possibly replacing one of your develop it scores with that, just because I think it's really, really important. And when I say that, is you could even choose for the last one, right? But I would tell you, think about where you would use that. I just want to put that out there. Okay, so I will leave you with this, and if I didn't show it to you, I'm going to show it to you here, is the idea that when you're having input fields, right, like here, just a simple required is all you would need for the user not to be able to hit submit, and that will prevent that from happening. So it's at bare minimum. This is like minimum start of validation that we would do. So, and I've told you this, but you'll definitely see this on the next round. Okay, so just to be clear, so in part 1, you need to implement this functionality into your whatever you did use for develop it 3, and see how much you were able to do on your own. Give me that feedback in your writing. Give us a link to your code, and do a print screen here. And then on this part, and I will update this, right? Anything about review develop it 3, your experience with HTML and CSS. And there was one other thing. What was the other thing here I was talking about? I'll have to think about that and include it here. I'm sure you probably remember more than I did, because I just talked about the idea of the other thing I would want. Oh yeah, is about how you're actually approaching the code ups, and how much time are you giving yourself, and do you feel like that's based on your own style, that you're getting the most that you can out of that content. All right, so I'm going to continue now reviewing the next section and looking at what we will do for our next Learn Together. I hope to have that done by the end of this coming weekend to try to jump ahead and make sure I'm getting content on a timely basis. Have a good rest of your week. Talk to you later.